She walked into the glass tower for the first time with her heart racing, her hands clutching the strap of her worn leather bag. The building was a monument of ambition, steel and glass stretching into the clouds, its polished doors reflecting back the hopeful light in her eyes. For Sarah, this was not just another job. This was her chance, her doorway to everything she had ever dreamed of. She had spent nights sketching buildings that only existed in her imagination, designs that blended art and structure, beauty and strength. And now here she was, stepping into the headquarters of one of the most prestigious architecture firms in the city, a place where ideas turned into landmarks, where dreams carved skylines. Sarah's heels clicked nervously against the marble floor as she entered the lobby. The grandeur of the space made her feel small, but not defeated. Every detail whispered wealth, power, and precision, the kind of world she longed to be part of. She adjusted her blazer, reminding herself she belonged here. Her first day began with hushed introductions, new faces, and stacks of blueprints taller than her desk. She smiled politely, kept her head down, and worked with quiet diligence. Yet in the back of her mind, she knew this was just the beginning. She wanted more than to be another name in a company ledger. She wanted her designs to breathe life into the city, and then he appeared, Daniel, the man everyone in the office spoke of with awe, envy, and sometimes fear. He was the firm's lead architect, its star, the man whose vision had shaped skylines and won contracts that others only dreamed of. Tall, confident, with a presence that filled the room before he even spoke. His suits were tailored, his smile practiced, his eyes sharp enough to cut through silence. When Daniel first noticed her, it was almost by accident. He passed her desk, his gaze falling on a sketch she had left half, finished in the corner of her notebook. It wasn't part of the project she had been assigned. It was hers, raw and untouched, a design she had imagined in the quiet of her apartment. "What's this?" His voice carried authority, yet something softer lingered beneath it. Sarah froze, heat rushing to her cheeks. Just a sketch, nothing official. Daniel picked up the paper without asking, studying the lines, the flow, the boldness of an idea too ambitious for a junior architect. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the drawing as though weighing its worth, and then slowly his lips curved into a smile. "You did this, yes," she whispered. He looked at her for the first time then, really looked at her. And in his eyes she saw something. Recognition, maybe even admiration. "You've got talent." He said simply, raw but real. The words clung to her like oxygen. In a single moment Daniel had seen her, not as another intern, not as a background figure in the firm, but as an architect, as an artist. From that day, things changed. Daniel stopped by her desk more often, asked about her ideas, and sometimes even invited her into meetings far above her pay grade. His presence was intimidating yet intoxicating. He was the kind of man who made people feel as though the world bent to his will, yet when he spoke to her, she felt like she mattered. One evening, as the office emptied and the city lights flickered awake outside, Daniel lingered by her desk. She was still working, lost in the details of a draft. "You're here late," he said. She looked up, startled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, just trying to get it right. He stepped closer, the glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across his face. "That's what I like about you, Sarah. You don't settle. Most people stop when it's good enough. You keep pushing until it's perfect." Her heart fluttered at the words. Praise from Daniel wasn't casual. It was currency, rare and powerful. As weeks turned into months, their connection deepened. It wasn't just professional anymore. There were late, night conversations about art, about life, about the city and its hidden beauty. There were fleeting touches, glances that lingered too long, moments charged with unspoken possibility. For Sarah, it was like a dream, having her mentor, her idol, her boss look at her not just as an employee, but as something more. She told herself she was careful, that she wasn't falling too fast, but every time Daniel smiled at her, every time he said her name, her defenses melted. She had never known a man like him. He carried himself like he owned the world, and maybe he did. But when he leaned close, when his voice softened and his hand brushed hers, she believed he saw her world too. In her heart, Sarah was certain she had found not only her career breakthrough but her soulmate. She trusted him, admired him, loved him in silence until he made the first move, a whispered invitation, a dinner that turned into something more. It felt inevitable, like the universe had aligned for them. He was her boss, her mentor, her lover, the man who held her hand in the dark and told her she had a future brighter than she dared to dream. And Sarah believed him, every word, every promise, every smile. What she didn't know was that behind those promises, behind that perfect smile, Daniel was already setting the stage for the greatest betrayal of her life. Subscribe to the scream of revenge. At first, Sarah thought it was just teamwork. Daniel would lean over her desk, his cologne lingering in the air, and ask for her thoughts on upcoming projects. She would nervously show him her sketches, ideas she had polished late into the night. He would listen intently, nod, and say, "This is brilliant. I'll take it into the meeting." Sarah smiled, proud that her ideas mattered enough to reach the highest rooms of the company, even if she wasn't there to present them. The first time it happened, she didn't even think twice. When the project was announced to the team, Daniel stood at the head of the table, charming investors with a dazzling presentation. The design looked familiar. Too familiar. It was hers, every detail, every curve, every bold decision. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak up, but then Daniel glanced at her across the room, his lips forming a subtle smile, his eyes reassuring, "I'll give you credit later." And she believed him. After the meeting, he brushed off her hesitation with practiced ease. "Sarah, it's all about strategy. Investors trust me. If I introduce it, it sells. Don't worry, when the timing is right, your name will shine." His words wrapped around her doubts like silk. He had a way of making lies sound like promises, of making theft feel like mentorship, and she, blinded by admiration and the flutter of his attention, let it slide. But then it happened again and again. Each time, Daniel carried her ideas into rooms she wasn't invited to. Each time, he rebranded her creativity as his own genius, and each time, he returned with sweet words to soothe her confusion. "You're young. If I put your name forward too soon, they'll crush you. Trust me. I'm protecting you." At night, when they were together, she wanted to ask him why her work always disappeared behind his smile. But then he would pull her close, whispering about the future, about building an empire together. His hands, his voice, his presence, all of it drowned out her doubts. Sarah told herself it was love. She told herself it was trust, but in reality it was control. The manipulation grew subtle, insidious. He would shower her with gifts one day, then criticize her ruthlessly the next. He would remind her that she needed him, that without his guidance she would be invisible in the cutthroat world of architecture. Once, when she suggested presenting her own concept, he laughed softly, shaking his head. "You're not ready for that kind of spotlight, Sarah. Let me handle it. One mistake and your career will be over before it begins." The words stung, but the way he said them, gentle, protective, as though he was saving her, made her swallow the pain. The office began to change too. Her colleagues, once warm and welcoming, now looked at her with distant curiosity. They whispered when she entered the room. She couldn't understand why, until she overheard two of them talking in the break room. She's only here because of Daniel. Everyone knows it. Yeah, he favors her. She probably doesn't even do half the work. Sarah froze, her heart sinking. She wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, that it was her ideas keeping Daniel in the spotlight. But her voice caught in her throat. How could she defend herself when the man she trusted most was the one silencing her? Daniel's grip on her tightened. He called it love, but it was possession. He decided where she went, who she spoke to, how her work was shared. He controlled the narrative, and she was the supporting character in her own story. One night, after a particularly successful presentation, another one built on her stolen designs, Daniel took her to dinner. The restaurant was dimly lit, elegant, filled with the hum of quiet conversations. "You see," he said, raising his glass of wine, "we're unstoppable together." She wanted to smile, to toast with him, but the words stuck, together. The success didn't have her name on it. It never did. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling, "when will they know it's my work?" For a moment the mask slipped, his eyes hardened, his smile thinned. Then, just as quickly, the charm returned. "Patience, love. Timing is everything. Do you trust me?" And because her heart still clung to the illusion of him, the man who once admired her sketches, the man who whispered about their future, she nodded, yes. But in that moment, something inside her cracked. A faint, almost imperceptible fracture. The manipulation was working, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and soon it would grow into rage, subscribe to the scream of revenge. The truth didn't come all at once. It began with whispers, fragments of conversations she wasn't meant to hear. A client congratulating Daniel on his revolutionary vision. A colleague joking that Sarah was just the pretty distraction in his office. Each word was a needle, small and sharp, piercing the thin veil of trust she still clung to. Sarah wanted to believe it was office gossip, jealousy, the kind of chatter that circled any successful man. But the unease gnawed at her, restless and hungry. Then came the night everything shattered. She had stayed late at the office, her desk buried in drafts and models. Daniel had told her he had an urgent meeting with investors, the kind that couldn't wait until morning. She didn't question it. She never did. But when she walked past the conference room on her way out, she froze. Through the glass walls she saw Daniel, laughing, drinking, his arm draped casually around the shoulders of a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was younger, dressed boldly, leaning close as if she already belonged to him. And on the screen behind them was her design. Sarah's breath hitched. She pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows, watching as Daniel pointed to the blueprint she had drawn, selling it as his own, charming the investors with his effortless charisma. The woman at his side kissed his cheek, and Daniel didn't push her away. The world tilted. Her chest tightened, a sickening weight pressing down on her lungs. She wanted to storm in, to scream, to expose him, but her legs felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by the cold realization. Everything had been a lie. The late night promises, the whispered dreams, the careful reassurances that her time would come. None of it was real. Daniel hadn't just stolen her ideas. He had stolen her trust, her ambition, her love, all of it twisted into a weapon he wielded for his own gain. When the meeting ended, she slipped out before he could see her. The city outside was alive with neon lights and rushing cars, but to her everything felt muted, blurred. She walked without direction, her thoughts spiraling. How could I have been so blind? The memory of his touch, his voice, his smile, it all felt tainted now, poisoned with deceit. She replayed every moment, every warning sign she had ignored. The way he deflected her questions, the way her colleagues whispered, the way he kept her in the shadows. And then, like a knife twisting deeper, she remembered his words, "Do you trust me?" Her stomach churned. She wanted to vomit out every trace of him, every memory he had carved into her soul. That night she didn't sleep. She sat at her desk in her small apartment, staring at the sketches that had once filled her with hope. Her hands shook as she flipped through them, recognizing the bones of Daniel's masterpieces in each one. It wasn't just one project, it was all of them. Every triumph he had paraded before the firm, every award, every contract. It was her work, her vision, stolen and repackaged behind his flawless smile. Tears blurred her eyes, falling onto the paper, staining the ink. The heartbreak was unbearable, but beneath it, something darker stirred, anger, the kind that burned hot and relentless, searing through her veins, consuming the weakness of her grief. He had used her, he had lied to her, he had humiliated her, and now she knew the truth. The next morning Daniel greeted her as if nothing had happened. He leaned casually on her desk, complimenting her draft, promising another big opportunity was coming. His eyes sparkled with that same deceptive charm, the same practiced intimacy, but this time Sarah didn't melt. She didn't blush or stammer. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the mask for what it was. A predator, a thief, a fraud. Her heart no longer fluttered. It hardened. She smiled back, but it wasn't the smile of a naive lover. It was the smile of someone who had seen behind the curtain, someone who had been broken but not destroyed. Inside, her resolve crystallized. He thought she was weak. He thought she would stay silent, invisible, grateful for crumbs of validation. He was wrong. Sarah would not be his victim anymore. For every lie, for every stolen idea, for every piece of her he had taken, she would make him pay. Not with tears, not with pleading, but with something far more devastating. Revenge. Subscribe to the scream of revenge. Sarah didn't leave her apartment for 3 days. The curtains stayed closed, shutting out the world. The walls seemed to press in tighter with every passing hour. Empty coffee mugs and crumpled sketches covered the floor, remnants of sleepless nights where she replayed every conversation, every lie Daniel had ever told her. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from colleagues, voicemails from Daniel, emails about projects. She ignored them all. His words echoed in her head over and over. "Do you trust me?" And each time it struck like a blade. She had trusted him. She had believed in him, and he had fed on that trust like a parasite, draining her ambition, hollowing her out until there was nothing left but the shell of a woman who used to dream. On the 4th day, she dragged herself to the mirror. Her reflection startled her. Hollow eyes, skin pale, lips dry. She barely recognized herself. The girl who once carried hope in her smile was gone. But behind the despair, in the depths of her broken gaze, something flickered, a spark. It terrified her at first. Rage wasn't something she had allowed herself to feel. Not fully. She had always chosen patience, kindness, forgiveness. But now, forgiveness tasted like poison. She picked up one of her ruined sketches from the floor. The lines were smudged by her tears, the paper crumpled. For a moment, she wanted to rip it apart, to destroy the last reminder of the dreams he had stolen. Instead, she smoothed it out, slowly, carefully, because beneath the pain she realized something chilling. Daniel hadn't destroyed her talent. He hadn't stolen her ability to create. He had stolen credit, yes. He had stolen trust, but the fire that fueled her designs, that was still hers, and that meant she still had power. Sarah straightened, her trembling hands curling into fists. "He didn't just steal my heart," she whispered to herself, her voice raw but steady. "He stole my dreams, and for that he will pay." The seed of revenge had been planted. The next weeks were a blur of survival. She forced herself back into the office, though her presence was quieter, colder now. She avoided eye contact, avoided conversation, and when Daniel tried to charm her, she responded with a polite mask. Inside, however, every moment with him was agony. Every smile he faked, every meeting where he paraded her work. It was gasoline on the fire burning inside her. At night she couldn't sleep. She sat in darkness, replaying his betrayals like a film she couldn't turn off. But gradually the scenes began to shift in her mind. Instead of imagining herself helpless, broken, she began to imagine something else, Daniel falling. Daniel exposed, Daniel stripped of everything he had taken. The thought of it gave her strength. One evening, as the city glowed outside her window, she whispered aloud, as if making a vow to the night, "I will not beg. I will not cry. I will not forget. He thinks he's untouchable, but I'll show him what it feels like to lose everything." Her voice was steady now, carrying a venom it had never known before. From that night on, Sarah was no longer the naive woman who had trusted Daniel blindly. She was something new, something sharpened by betrayal. She started keeping a journal, not of dreams but of evidence. She recorded dates, meetings, projects. She noted the designs he had stolen, the lies he had told. Every detail was fuel for the war she was preparing to wage. Her colleagues noticed the change. The whispers in the office grew louder. "She's different now." They murmured, colder, sharper. Even Daniel noticed. One afternoon he leaned against her desk, flashing the smile that once made her heart race. "You've been quiet lately," he said, tilting his head, studying her. Something wrong. Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Inside, her heart hammered with fury, but her voice was calm. "No, Daniel, nothing's wrong." He smirked, satisfied, and walked away. He didn't realize that the silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Every lie he told her had built a cage around her, but now she wasn't the one trapped. He was, and he didn't even know it yet. Sarah had fallen into darkness, but in that darkness she found clarity. She would not forgive. She would not forget. She would rise, and when she did, Daniel would burn. Subscribe to the scream of revenge. Maya No, Sarah, moved through the office like a ghost wearing someone else's skin. Her face was polite, her voice soft when colleagues greeted her, but underneath that composed surface an engine of calculation had begun to roar. She had learned, in the coldest way possible, how power lived in records, in small overlooked details, in the places a predator assumed no one was watching. If Daniel had built his world on stolen blueprints and borrowed trust, then she would dismantle it in the only language that mattered to him, proof. She began quietly, with ordinary things that nobody thought to protect. A folder left unlocked on a shared drive, an old email chain buried in the archives that linked Daniel's name to an books account. A draft saved under the wrong file name that contained sentences she recognized, the exact phrasing of a pitch she had once confessed to him at 3 in the morning. These were tiny fissures. Each one looked harmless on its own. Together they would form an earthquake. Sarah trained her eyes to notice what others dismissed. She learned the rhythm of Daniel's days, the way he paused before certain calls, the names he never spoke aloud in meetings, the junior associates he favored and the ones he dismissed. She replaced heartbreak with patience. She learned to smile when he entered a room, to laugh at the jokes that once made her chest flutter, and to stay late at night under the pretense of finishing minor edits. At first it was theater, pretending to be docile, pretending to be grateful, but the performance gave her access. People let their guard down around the woman they thought had been tamed. Her first real victory was a simple thing. A backup drive Daniel kept in his drawer, the one he believed contained only vanity files and award photos. She discovered how he left it unlocked one evening after an investor dinner, all swagger and surplus charm, and she took it home under the pretense of returning it the next morning. The drive hummed in her apartment like a captured heartbeat. When she opened it, the glow of stolen concepts and duplicated presentations filled her screen. Designs she had sketched in ragged notebooks were there, with his name stamped across the cover slides. Contracts showed payments were routed to shell companies. Emails proved that investors had been fed polished lies. It was, in the coldest sense, his life in files. She made copies, quiet, discreet duplicates saved to a cloud account he would never suspect a junior could touch. She catalogued everything with the clinical precision of someone writing a legal brief. Dates, timestamps, version histories, the metadata that proved authorship. She turned emotions into evidence. Where her tears had once blurred ink, now her focus sharpened letters into indictments. But evidence alone was not enough. Daniel's public persona, suave, indispensable, untouchable, mattered as much as the documents. She needed a stage and an audience for the collapse. She began planting seeds elsewhere, small insinuations in casual conversations with colleagues whose loyalties were never ironclad. She slipped copies of innocuous files to associates she knew had anxieties about the firm's future. She offered advice over coffee to a junior account manager who had been overlooked for promotion, subtly steering him toward questions to ask at meetings. She did not lie. She merely taught others to notice what she had noticed, to pay attention to the pattern of Daniel's luck. As she gathered allies, she learned something brutal about human nature. People are willing to believe the story that benefits them. A quietly curious operations director found, tucked inside a folder, a dated note that suggested funds were being siphoned. He mentioned it in a whispered tone that soon reached the legal team. An embarrassed associate forwarded to a friend at a small investigative outlet a photograph of a contract signature that didn't match the official records. Each small act of attention, each tiny betrayal of complacency, widened the path she was carving. The nights were the most productive. While the rest of the firm slept, Sarah mapped the network that supported Daniel. Contacts, vendors, offshore accounts. She learned the language of audits, the patterns that tilted a ledger from plausible to fraudulent. She reached out in polite emails to vendors she had never met, feigning clerical questions and discovering where money flowed. She hacked her way carefully and legally, finding public filings, following paper trails, requesting records under the guise of departmental audits. She became fluent in corporate shadows. The danger was constant. Daniel was not merely careless. He was a predator who recognized threats before others did. He began to sense slight turbulence, an offhand question in a meeting, an investor's query about account discrepancies, but he attributed it to the normal hazards of a busy firm. He tightened his smile and staged his dismissals. He assumed that anybody stirring the water was just a jealous subordinate, and that his empire's sheen would be enough to repel curious minds. Sarah let him have that illusion. Let him mistake the tremor for gossip. She calibrated every risk. When she leaked a single invoice to a journalist who specialized in corporate malpractice, she made sure that journalistic interest would dovetail with the legal avenues she had quietly primed. When she placed a carefully redacted document with an anxious board member, the man who had once nodded at Daniel's brilliance now had a seed of doubt. Sarah's moves were never obvious. They were 1,000 thin cuts rather than a single slash. Each cut convinced another person to look more closely. Even her relationships at the firm became tools. She befriended the executive assistant, an efficient woman with a memory like a steel trap, who unwittingly provided calendar entries and notes from meetings Daniel assumed were private. She soothed and flattered, not because she enjoyed the deception, but because she was building a coalition of mundane witnesses who would, when the time came, confirm the facts her files would prove. There were nights when the weight of it all nearly buckled her resolve, when she found a draft of an award speech with her concept referenced as a team contribution, and Daniel's name listed as lead. The foreboding returned like a wave. She sat with the documents and breathed until rage turned to motion. This was no longer about revenge in the small, personal way she had imagined. It had become structural. She was not out for spectacle. She wanted the edifice toppled. She wanted the people who had bowed to Daniel's charisma to recognize the architecture of his fraud, and so she kept building a leak here, a conversation steered there, a trusted insider given a reason to ask questions. She timed her actions to the firm's rhythms, scheduling a single revelation to coincide with an investor review, nudging another fact into a board member's inbox just before a crucial vote. It was strategy, it was surgical. It required patience and an almost sociopathic willingness to hold space for the slow burn of consequence. The most daring move was psychological. Sarah confronted her own fear by going public, but only partially. She allowed moments of controlled vulnerability to surface, an office apology to a junior architect whose work had been credited elsewhere, a quiet question raised in a department meeting about attribution and recognition. These gestures seemed small, human. They were also arrows aimed at the firm's conscience. People who had previously admired Daniel's effortless dominance now felt the uneasy tug of fairness. Conversations shifted from admiration to skepticism. Each misgiving became a crack. All the while, Daniel strutted through the halls, oblivious to the scaffolding collapsing around him. He still smiled like a man who owned the room, still accepted accolades and basked in flattering profiles. But his mirror had begun to fog. A reporter's call he barely answered, an investor's off-hand question about discrepancies he wished away. Sarah watched from the perimeter and allowed herself a tight, private satisfaction. This was not a cathartic scream. It was an engineer's patient demolition, 1 month before the big annual investor presentation, the moment of greatest exposure for anyone in the firm. She initiated the final phase. She assembled a dossier that read like a prosecutor's exhibit, chronological emails showing Daniel passing her work off as his own, bank transfers to shell companies, vendor invoices rerouted, and draft files with her metadata intact. She wrapped it in narrative, not just numbers, because truth without story rarely moves people. And then, because even the most ironclad plan needed a human hand to push it across the threshold, she did what she had dreaded but always known would be necessary. She trusted other people with the truth. She handed the dossier carefully, with legal-minded notes to the only ally she felt certain she could coerce into action, a senior partner who had once admired her sketches and now watched Daniel's empire with a quiet, private curiosity. She did not plead. She did not threaten. She simply handed over the file and let someone in authority feel the weight of what she had compiled. That night, as the city glittered below her window, Sarah sat with her own reflection. She had exchanged humiliation for strategy, tears for documents. The folder on her lap contained not only proofs of Daniel's crimes, but the culmination of months of patient, meticulous work. Her chest felt hollow and strangely full at once. She had become something she had never imagined, an architect of ruin as precise as any building she'd ever dreamed of creating. The plan was in motion. The stage was set. The next time Daniel stood before investors and colleagues, he would not be able to charm his way out of the evidence stacked against him. The empire he had polished with other people's labor was rigged to fall, and Sarah had been the one to plant the seeds. She thought of the nights spent crumpling her sketches in fury, of the way his hand had once rested possessively on hers, as if ownership could be claimed like a signature. Those memories no longer shackled her. They had become mortar for the structure she intended to bring down. She had learned that destruction, like creation, required a plan, and beneath it all a quiet voice, the same one that had whispered vows in the dark, resolved itself into something cleaner, more dangerous. This was not merely revenge. It was reclamation. Subscribe to the scream of revenge. The annual investor presentation was his arena, the place where he transformed numbers into poetry and projections into promises. That morning he stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, flashing the smile that had seduced investors and disarmed rivals for years. He looked flawless, as always, the perfect image of control. But control is fragile when truth waits behind the curtain. Sarah sat in the back row of the grand conference hall, her notebook closed on her lap. To anyone watching, she looked like just another junior employee, dutiful and attentive. Inside, her heartbeat thundered. Today was the day the cracks would show. The presentation began smoothly. Daniel strutted across the stage, his voice rich, his gestures confident. Investors leaned forward, nodding as graphs rose and slides dazzled. For the first 20 minutes, it felt like every other year. Daniel weaving illusions, commanding the room. Then it began. The first question came from an older board member, a man known for silence more than speech. He raised a hand, his voice calm but sharp. "Daniel, this slide references a design submitted under your name. Can you explain why the metadata lists a different author?" A hush rippled through the audience. Daniel blinked, his smile faltering for the briefest second. Metadata. He laughed lightly, as though amused. Ah, must be a clerical oversight. Our team works collaboratively. Attribution isn't always precise. But the seed was planted. A second investor leaned in, flipping through a thick packet of notes. "And what about these invoices? Funds appear rerouted through a vendor in Singapore that doesn't seem to exist. Could you clarify?" The room stiffened. Sarah watched, her pulse steady now as Daniel's charm began to fracture. He adjusted his tie again, his grin tightening like a mask. "These are complex financial structures, perfectly legal, I assure you." But murmurs spread. Investors exchanged glances, whispering. The air shifted from admiration to suspicion. Sarah's dossier had done its work. The questions were too precise, too interconnected to dismiss as coincidence. Each inquiry was a domino, and Daniel was trapped in the middle of the fall. By the time the third wave of questions came, emails, contracts, signatures that didn't match, his voice had lost its velvet tone. Sweat glistened at his temples. His answers grew clipped, defensive. The aura of invincibility cracked before everyone's eyes. In the back row, Sarah's lips curled into the faintest smile. She had imagined this moment for months, the unraveling of his empire not with a dramatic explosion, but with the slow, public erosion of trust. After the presentation, chaos erupted. Investors huddled in groups, their voices urgent. The board called for an emergency meeting. Daniel disappeared behind closed doors, his charm useless now. The whispers followed him. Fraud, theft, betrayal, words he had once used to control others now circled him like vultures. Sarah moved quietly through the halls, watching it unfold. Colleagues who once worshipped Daniel now avoided eye contact. Assistants whispered behind hands. Journalists called the firm nonstop, hungry for scandal. The empire was cracking, and Daniel knew it. That night, Daniel stormed into his office, slamming the door. For the first time, his mask slipped completely. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands, muttering curses. How did this happen? He growled to his reflection in the darkened window, "Who's behind this?" But the more he tried to trace the sabotage, the more it felt like shadows closing in. Every direction he turned, the evidence was waiting. Every ally he reached for had begun to step back, and in the quiet of her own apartment, Sarah sat at her desk, reviewing the headlines spreading across the financial world. Each article chipped away at his reputation. Each leak was a reminder that his empire wasn't built on brilliance, but on stolen foundations. Sarah leaned back, closing her eyes. For the first time in months, she felt peace, not because the war was over, but because victory had finally become visible. Daniel's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was burning, and she was the one who had lit the match. Subscribed to the scream of revenge. Daniel hadn't slept in days. The man who once walked into rooms like a king now staggered through the office like a fugitive. His tailored suits hung loose, his eyes were bloodshot, his voice cracked when he barked orders no one listened to any more. Phones rang unanswered, emails piled up without replies. The empire that once moved at his command now resisted him at every turn. But Daniel wasn't the kind to surrender. Deep down, he believed if he could just silence the noise, patch the cracks, he could rebuild. He called emergency meetings, promised explanations, even begged investors in hushed phone calls. Sarah knew this was his instinct, to fight until the last breath. That was why her final strike had to be undeniable. For months she had gathered files, leaks, whispers. Now she had something bigger, the truth in his own voice. Late nights had taught her to be invisible. She had slipped a tiny recorder into the drawer he kept closest to him, hidden beneath the clutter of pens and papers. For weeks it had captured everything: private conversations, desperate calls, drunken confessions. Most were mundane, but one night Daniel had spoken too freely to a trusted accomplice. "They'll never catch me. I've been stealing from these idiots for years. You think some junior architect will ruin me. She worships me. She'll never turn." Sarah had listened to that recording over and over, the words burning like acid. Worship never turn. He had underestimated her to the very end. Now that recording was in the hands of the board, the investors, and the press. The morning it was released, the firm erupted in chaos. News channels played Daniel's voice on repeat, his arrogance echoing through every living room and office. Social media tore him apart. Hashtags branded him a fraud, a thief, a manipulator. Colleagues who had once lined up to praise him now rushed to distance themselves. In the middle of it all, Daniel stormed into the boardroom, veins pulsing in his neck. "This is a setup," he shouted, slamming his fists on the table. "Someone planted this. You know me. You've trusted me for years." But the board members' faces were cold, unmoved. "Trust," one of them said quietly, "is exactly what you destroyed." Security escorted him out. Cameras flashed as he was led past reporters. His empire didn't crumble in silence, it collapsed in spectacle. Sarah stood at the far end of the corridor, watching. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Her victory wasn't in the humiliation. It was in the justice. For once, the truth wasn't hidden behind charm. It was undeniable. That night, as the city lights glimmered, Sarah sat at her desk sketching again. Her lines were steady, her vision clear. She wasn't drawing buildings this time, but something more abstract, structures that looked like ruins, like monuments to arrogance. She drew them not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that even the strongest empires could fall when they were built on lies. For months she had carried the weight of betrayal, the bitterness of heartbreak. Tonight she felt lighter, not healed, not whole, but free. Daniel had taken her trust, her love, her work. She had taken everything he thought could never be touched, his reputation, his empire, his power. And as she closed her sketchbook, Sarah whispered to herself, not in anger but in certainty, "Revenge isn't destruction, it's reclamation." Subscribe to the scream of revenge. The storm had passed. Daniel's name, once celebrated in glossy magazines and grand conferences, now lived in headlines drenched in scandal. His empire was sold piece by piece, lawsuits filed in every court, and his friends vanished like smoke. The man who thought he was untouchable had been reduced to whispers, a cautionary tale in the corporate world. Sarah, meanwhile, walked through the same city streets with a different kind of silence, not the silence of fear, but of strength. Her steps were steady, her shoulders lighter. She had faced betrayal, humiliation, heartbreak, and she had risen, not broken, but sharper, more unyielding. People in the firm began to look at her differently. No longer the timid junior who once sat at the edge of meetings, afraid to speak. She had become a symbol of courage, of quiet rebellion against corruption. Some approached her with respect, some with awe. Others with whispers of apology for never standing beside her when Daniel's shadow loomed. But Sarah didn't crave recognition. Her victory wasn't in their validation. It was in reclaiming herself, the confidence, the dignity, the power Daniel had tried to strip away. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood by the firm's rooftop terrace. The city sprawled out before her like an endless blueprint. She thought of the girl she used to be, the one who believed charm was love, who mistook guidance for loyalty, who handed her heart and her ideas into unworthy hands. That girl had been shattered, but from her pieces a woman had been forged, stronger, wiser, unafraid. Sarah exhaled softly. Revenge hadn't given her happiness. Happiness was something she would have to rebuild on her own. But revenge had given her justice, and justice was the ground on which new beginnings could stand. The lesson wasn't about destroying Daniel. It was about refusing to let betrayal define her. Because betrayal cuts deep, but it doesn't have to bury you. Because love can blind you, but it can also awaken you. Because revenge isn't about cruelty, it's about reclaiming what was stolen. Sarah turned from the skyline, her voice calm but steady, as though speaking to every woman, every man who had ever been broken by someone they trusted. Never underestimate the quiet ones. We may not shout, we may not fight loudly, but we endure, and when we rise with fire. Her story wasn't just about a man's downfall. It was about resilience, about the power of standing back up after betrayal, about the truth that no empire, no matter how mighty, can survive when it's built on lies. As she walked away from the terrace, the city lights glimmered below, and it felt as though the night itself bowed to her strength. Her chapter with Daniel was closed, but her story was just beginning. Subscribe to the Scream of Revenge.